Hi there. I'm Marjorie Cotty, and this is 50 Plus. You're wondering what all those good-looking guys were up there, aren't you, huh? Well, I guess it has to do with the fact that as you get older, you think back to who were the heroes, whether it was in a comic strip or in a movie or television. Whether it was Mr. Tough Guy, Mr. Western Hero, that Marine Sergeant, they all became sort of epic figures in our mind. And when you hear nowadays that so-and-so has died or got Alzheimer's, or you see a picture of them that was taken with their grandchildren, you think, that can't be Spencer Tracy, that can't be the people I've thought of as heroes. And I think the thing is that we all have to recognize that we do get older. Well, some of us get older, some of us don't get older. And a lot of the heroes in the world are not those screen figures that we've always thought about. A hero could be the firefighter who lives next door. It could be the man down the block who runs off to help somebody. You never know the story that people have unless you ask. So often we're so busy telling our own stories. I'm talking too much. I'm telling my own story. That we don't find out about other people. Now, I have a guest today, Frank Montelone, and you're going to tell me I didn't pronounce that correctly.
No, you did just fine.
Thank you. You're very kind. Now, I could just see this gentleman here. Looks like, sort of a very jolly Santa Claus, only better. All right? And you say, well, gee, supposing I had just met you and knew nothing about you, what you do, what's your business, where do you live? What is your business? What was your business?
I did many things, but the last 35 years before I retired, I had my own business. I was a custom tailor.
Well, there you are, you see. I mean, this
what an exciting story.
Yeah, exactly. And I keep trying to remember that fairy tale about the tailor that was killing flies, and he killed 10 at one blow. And the story went around that the man had killed 10 at one blow, and they thought it was people and not flies. And
I was too busy for that.
No flies on that man.
No.
Well, what I find out is that seems like just a very charming gentleman. Actually, during World War II, was in the American OSS,
right.
Office of Strategic Services.
Right.
That's how I started. Secret spy stuff, right?
Well, I thought it was, but
yeah.
It just seemed like every day to me.
Tell us about it. I'm not going to say another word. I want you to talk and tell us about what you did.
Well, in 1942, I enlisted in the Navy, the end of 1942, and I went to Sampson, New York, and from Sampson, New York, I went to radio school in Indianapolis, and at that point, I come across someone by the name of Commander Green, and he recruited me to join the OSS because he felt I spoke a foreign language, and it was something that they needed. And that's how it all started. I knew nothing about it.
How old were you?
I was 18.
See, that's what's so incredible.
Yeah, right. I have grandchildren now that are older than that. They're in college, and I still look at them and I say, they're babies, forgetting that at 18 I was already in the service. I can't make the connection, but the war made a difference. In those days, the war came along and you got old quickly.
Yeah, it's incredible to think that now we worry if a child goes to college out of state.
Oh, yes.
You think, oh, golly, how are they going to manage? Who'll do their laundry?
That's right.
And when you think that comparative youngsters. We're flying bombers. We're fighting on the beaches. It's unbelievable. Tell us what you did.
Well, I trained in and around Washington, D.C. in the various camps that the OSS had. And after training, I was shipped overseas. The training consisted of various types of activities that were required in the OSS. Small arms, we did now they call it, now they call it something, that's it. Now they call it something else, but it was judo, really.
Really?
Yeah, that's right. And of course it was a short form. It's not like it was a complete study, but it was something that we needed for the type of work that we were supposed to do. And then radio work, and of course we trained on small arms fire, various different things that were quite interesting. It just doesn't seem to stick with me. I can't remember too much about it anymore. But it was very interesting to me because at that time I hadn't even been out of Brooklyn yet. My first trip out of Brooklyn, I went to Camp Sampson, New York. And so it was exciting, just being in the OSS. And after training, I went to North Africa. And there
Imagine. I mean, sometimes, people think it's a big deal. Hey, you're going to Chicago? You went, well, I went to North Africa. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
it was experience for somebody who's not even 20 yet.
Well, that's the way I feel about it now. At the time, it was very, very exciting. And I couldn't imagine me being on a ship going overseas. That was in itself something for me. In fact, well, I arrived in North Africa, and I trained in
Where in North Africa?
Oran, which was the port where most of the troops entered. This was after the war ended in North Africa, and they were starting to train people for the invasion of Italy. And at that point, there were maybe 50, 60 men in my particular group.
The OSS.
And the OSS. Well, there were various different groups, but we were a group that was eventually split up into two groups. And then we went into Italy at the Salerno.
Basically, I guess you would call it military intelligence, would you not?
Yes, that's what it was. And our job was really to collect intelligence for the different armies, the American 5th and the British 8th. I was assigned to the British 8th Army. In fact, all during the war in Italy, I worked with the British 8th Army. And what we did was we trained local people, and we made them partisans. We trained them in our methods, how to use our radios, how to use our code system.
Were you behind enemy lines?
Yes. That came a little later. After we trained these guys, we would take them in behind the lines, and we would set them up. And they would gather intelligence, and they would send it back to us, and we would...
How could you know? I mean, you were young.
Yes.
How could you know whether or not these people would betray you?
Well, to be honest with you, we didn't know. But we felt, after we met these people, most of them were from the, almost out of everyday life in Italy. But they had strong feelings about the war at that time, especially after it seems that they had lost the war. And they said, they felt that maybe we could do something to change the attitude. People would think that we were losers, because at that time they were our enemy, And as a result, they were anxious to get started with us. And after, we had someone who did nothing but recruit these young people, men and women, by the way. I say young, but they were older than I was. And after training them, we would take them out into the field, leave them. I remember one mission, we went up into northern Italy, and that was our first contact with partisan groups. And we took agents with us and left the agents with the partisan groups.
Weren't you scared?
I tell you the truth, I did not at the beginning, but after my first encounter with the partisans, then I became frightened. And but the work I did, I was always away from danger. You know, it seems that the idea was to avoid it.
Yeah, I guess
And we didn't want to be
a good mind is a terrible thing to waste.
something. And as a result, we were rarely in combat, if ever. What we did was we got the information and we gave it to the troops who needed it in combat. In my case, it was the British Eighth Army. And this went on for, well, the length of the war.
When I think about the immensity of, you know, if I had just met you socially and you know, we talked about the latest politics and what's happening here and there, and I would never have known or dreamt. And yet, what a feeling it must have been. A young kid from Brooklyn.
That's right.
And suddenly you're thrown into another group, if you're working with the British Eighth Army.
That's right.
People from a totally different background. I mean, we're not talking about what a change it was for us. Of course, some people went into the armed forces who said, golly, suddenly I met somebody from Tennessee or California, which would have been a novelty for you, and
Sure.
I'm sure it happened to you during
Yes,
training.
yes, yes.
But suddenly, you're meeting up with the British, a completely different culture, same language, sort of.
Yes.
But
Being from Brooklyn, it was quite different.
yeah, did you find that they were cold and austere? And
No. I don't believe that at all. I remember
No, I don't either.
at the
I'm
very
kidding.
beginning, our particular group, by the way, were 12 men. And there were several officers, and the rest of us were enlisted men. However, the uniforms we wore had no markings, so we didn't know who was who so much. At least I knew that who was who, but the British, when we first met them, they couldn't figure out who was the officer in charge here and who were these other people. But after a while, you know, at the very beginning, they couldn't imagine why the American officers and the enlisted men lived together and ate together, worked together, and were on a first-name basis. They couldn't imagine that. And when they got to know the operation we had, then they began to understand. And I found them great people to work with. They were all entirely different than my background, you know. I found them well-educated by my standards, seemed very bright. In many cases, I found them to be very courageous because I had heard stories of what they did. So meeting the British was a pleasure with me. I really enjoyed it. And I've been in contact with them now since the war. In fact, on occasion, I write to them, and they write to me, and I talk to them, and they talk to me. In fact, my daughter's going over to London Friday to meet up with some of the fellows that I knew in World War II.
It's so incredible.
Yeah, yeah.
Now,
Still see each other.
now you came from Brooklyn, I assume an Italian neighborhood?
Yes, yes. And I was an orphan also.
What? I didn't know that. Tell me.
Sure. Yeah, I was an orphan.
How did you happen to, were you in an orphan asylum?
I was at one time.
I think they're called institutions now, or something
We
else.
used to call them a home.
A home.
Yeah, I'm going to put them away in a home. That's where I ended up. An orphanage is what it really was, run by the Catholic Church at that time. I imagine, because there must be other homes around. And then I bounced around from relative to relative to relative until I got old enough to be on my
May I
own.
ask what happened to your folks?
Well, my mother died when I was 9, and my father kind of, in those days, if you were poor and you lost your wife, that kind of relieved you of your responsibilities and you took off. It seemed that way to me anyway.
Well, yeah, but you know, and I think back at it when I think about my grandmother and even my mother to a certain degree. It used to be that when you had a woman in the house, it wasn't a question of independence. It was a question that you had to do the laundry in a laundry tub.
Right.
You couldn't go into the store and say, well, I'm Dad, I'm home from work, and I'll get out some frozen dinners and all these prepared foods or take out. It just wasn't
It was
there.
unheard of.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, a woman depended on the fact that she'd take summer vegetables and fruits and she'd can them
That's it.
and bake her own bread.
In many
And,
cases,
you know,
sure.
it was considered a treat, I know, for my grandmother to have sliced bread.
Sure.
Well, you know, who wants that old homemade bread when you can get sliced
bread from the store?
From the store, yeah. So that I would imagine someone like your father, not knowing him or the circumstances or anything, but that for a man to try and bring up children, when when you had the laundry, the cleaning, and none of the appliances that would help, it must have been a very difficult thing. And
It was. I realize it now more than ever. You know, at the time I thought it was kind of mean that he should
Well, darn right.
put me into a home, and get me off his, well, anyway, that was done.
Well, how did you learn Italian then? Well enough so that you could be advanced to OSS?
In those days, everyone spoke Italian. In our particular circle, everyone spoke Italian. My father spoke Italian. When my mother was alive, she spoke Italian. My aunts and uncles, my grandmother, grandfather, and your neighbors. Everybody in the neighborhood spoke Italian. And then the only English we spoke was in school. And probably I was more proficient at Italian than I was English. Still am, I think.
Yeah, really?
Yeah. Although I don't use it.
Am I hearing things or do you hear music? I'm deaf, and so I sometimes wonder if I'm hearing things. Go away, music, go away, noises. I'm having a nice talk with this man.
Yeah,
I can hear music, I can hear pounding. Oh, well, whatever. As long as I'm not hearing things. As long as you can reassure me.
I don't hear it in Italian, though.
That's very funny. But I think one of our technicians might explore where that noise is coming from. But whatever. I'm curious about something, and I hope you don't mind if I bring it up. Now, you lived in a neighborhood where Italian was a common language.
Sure.
How did you feel? And I'd ask the same question about somebody who lived in a German neighborhood. How did you feel during the war when, at the beginning, Italy was the enemy?
Sure.
Do you remember back?
Of course, I remember that. And up to World War II, I remember listening to the radio on occasion when I would with a relative, and they'd be listening to the Italian radio. And of course, there was confusion. They didn't know whether to go along with things that were happening in Italy, go along with what was happening here. And what forced our hand in this country was when the war started. And at that point, everybody felt American, even the Italians. It's just strange, but we just never thought of ourselves as the enemy. And I think
there was never any of the persecution, was there? I mean, after all, Brooklyn is right there where you could see ships going in and out and worry about spies or things like that.
No, I'm sure it existed, but it never entered my mind. As a young man, as a young boy, those things weren't important. Just being alive and getting by day was the important thing on my mind. Politics never entered my mind.
You see, I think so many young people today, the people who watch this show, might remember back to, not that I do, yes I do, I do remember. Prior to World War II, there was a strong feeling of pacifism in the United States. We've been over there, World War I, we went over, we did it for them again.
Right.
It was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Who wants to send our boys over there? And if it hadn't been for Pearl Harbor, we might have had a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
And very different.
The German Bund were holding meetings all over and encouraging the pacifism, America stay out of it. So I just
my neighborhood bordered a German neighborhood.
Oh, tell me about it.
Sure. Ridgewood, Brooklyn, and Ridgewood, Queens, side by side. The only dividing line was a street that ran through the neighborhood. And on the other side, everybody was German, and on our side, everybody was Italian. And I remember that On occasion, we would say, Shermans live over there. Only we said it in Italian.
How do you say it in Italian? I want to hear it.
Sono tedeschi. They're German. And but we had nothing in common. We never met, we never spoke, but we knew they were there. And we keep our eyes, because Germans really, at that time, I don't think, they were just beginning to warm up to Italians, but prior to that, in World War II, and World War I, they weren't very good friends, There were problems then, too. So it didn't matter. Then I found out when, every time we'd go to a pool, and there was a school in a German neighborhood, Grover, Cleveland, and they had a swimming pool that kids would use on occasion. For an hour, you could go in there and swim. And I started to meet these German kids. And I didn't notice any difference at all. They're just nice guys, or bad guys, or depends who you met, Just that they were German and we weren't.
Well, how did it feel when you got into Italy and found everybody spoke Italian?
A strange thing happened when we landed in Salerno, and I went up on deck on the ship, and I just looked around and I said, "Geez, it seems like I've been here before." I couldn't imagine why it looked so familiar to me. Even the smells, the noises, the sounds, and little boys out in boats diving for coins, And I said, it seems very, very familiar. And then when I got into towns and villages and cities, I never felt strange at all. Felt like I've been here all my life. And I couldn't understand it. And I think they have a word for it that I don't use too often, déjà vu or something.
Déjà vu?
Yeah, well, and I guess that's what it was.
Yeah, it's so strange.
I never felt, I felt stranger in North Africa, because there, again, the languages were different. They spoke French and Arabic, and I found that difficult, Although we worked with them too,
Yeah, well, I had the same thing. I went to live in the Middle East.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Whereabouts?
I lived in Baghdad, and I lived in Beirut. In fact, I got my bachelor's degree from the American University of Beirut.
Beirut, all right.
And in Istanbul and in Ankara.
That must have been exciting for you.
Yeah. And you see, that's it. 99 and 9/10 of the people that I interview haven't got the foggiest notion, that I lived abroad. And frankly, they couldn't care less.
Well,
I can't really blame them.
I find it interesting.
But for a young girl, and I went there with a 6-week-old baby, went off to Baghdad, across the desert on a bus, no road, traveling by the stars. It was all very exciting and certainly very, very different. But I guess if there's one point to what we're talking about is that we don't find out enough about people.
That's right, exactly.
That too often we're trying to say, hey, this is me. And I've had to work so hard myself to say, shut up, Margie, listen to people. If there's one thing about doing this show, where we're all volunteers, the crew, myself, all of us, is that I should listen to people. Everybody has a story. You, I know, told your story. We got very interested in recording the memories of veterans of all wars. And my producer, Ted Kazarski, said, this has got to be recorded. We can't let people go, so to speak, without hearing their stories. And
but the best part of this
is that the most marvelous case in point. Finding out about what you did, and I would never have known if I hadn't had this chance to say, talk to me, tell me about what was it like. So,
but I see now you've talked to me and you inquired about my background. I find you very interesting.
Now there you are.
I should interview you
next time around, folks.
Of course.
But folks, get out there, volunteer. Ask in your own family, what is their story? Get in touch with Ted Kazarski about Veterans Memorial Archives. In the meantime, at least you've had the good sense to watch 50 Plus and meet Frank Montelone.
And it's been my pleasure.
Ah, he's wonderful.